in Gaza and in Israeli cities is on show for the entire international community to bear witness to as the violence escalates. I join with honourable members on both sides of the House in condemning the violence on both sides. Sometimes the most difficult conversations are required with our allies. So what is the position of the British government on forced evictions and displacement of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem? And has the position been relayed to the Israeli government? And does the minister believe that Mr. Netanyahu's government is sincerely committed to a viable two-state solution, given the plan previously cooked up with President Biden's predecessor? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the UK government's position on settlements and evictions is long-standing and, as I say, has been communicated a number of times, both today at the dispatch box and at previous occasions in the dispatch box. We do, of course, outline directly to the Israeli government our position on such matters, and also from the dispatch box. And we will work with the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority and their regional friends and neighbours to work towards a sustainable two-state solution, which remains a priority UK foreign policy.
Let's go to Jane Hunt. Jane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents have contacted me about the recent reports from Jerusalem, and I share their concerns about the ongoing violence and unrest. I therefore welcome the government's strong call for calm and de-escalation. Does my right honourable friend agree that this violence is completely unacceptable and that all sides must now come together to de-escalate tensions and achieve a peaceful resolution?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady makes a very good point that ultimately peace has to be something which is delivered by both sides, and we call upon everybody to step back from the situation, not allow it to escalate further, and indeed de-escalate so we can see an end to this conflict. We will work tirelessly to achieve that, both bilaterally and through multilateral fora.
Mr. Speaker, the government's response to this and every other episode in Palestine is and are completely inadequate. The Palestinians have lived under brutalistic oppression and apartheid by Israel with the tacit consent of the West for too long. We've heard the plague on both their houses song too many times. Of course, we must condemn all violence on both sides. So in that spirit, can the Minister tell me whether he thinks it appropriate that the UK grant arms licences that sees UK weapons used in these indiscriminate Israeli attacks on civilians, including children?
Mr. Speaker, the government takes its arms export responsibilities very seriously, and we aim to operate one of the most robust arms export licences in the world. And we consider all our export applications against a strict risk assessment framework and keep all licences under careful and continual review as a standard.
Let's go to Andrew Selous. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while there is never any excuse for firing rockets on civilians, wouldn't Israelis sleep more soundly at night if access to all the holy sites was maintained as agreed in 1967, free Palestinian elections were allowed in East Jerusalem, and Palestinians were not being evicted from their homes in Jerusalem?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, the UK's position on evictions is well known. It is incredibly important that worshippers have access to these very holy sites in Jerusalem. We have been supportive of Palestinian Authority elections, and we push for them to go ahead, including in East Jerusalem.
Let's go to Janet Davey. Janet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we're seeing in the news is absolutely horrific. Many constituents have contacted me in the last few days about the violence against worshippers during Ramadan, as well as the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. Airstrikes on both sides must absolutely end, and I condemn this violence. As the occupying power, the Israeli government has legal obligations that it is not meeting. What is the UK government doing to ensure Israel adheres to international law?
The Honourable Lady is right that violence against peaceful worshippers of any faith is unacceptable. We condemn, as I've said, the rocket attacks from Gaza, and we will continue to be a voice for calm and region. A voice for calm and peace in this region, and we'll work with international partners, and that does include at times having difficult conversations with some of our friends in the region, but we are unafraid of doing so when necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The violence and the loss of life is tragic, and it does need to stop. But isn't it the case that right under the noses of the international community, Hamas has been allowed to build a terrorist city-state in Gaza? They've diverted humanitarian resources into stockpiling missiles behind civilian buildings. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's wrong to draw some kind of phony equivalence between the actions and the aggression of terrorists and the sovereign right of a legitimate democratic government to defend its citizens? I wouldn't expect the Minister at the Dispatch Box or anybody else in our government to do anything other than what the Israeli government is doing to defend its citizens.
Minister.
My right honourable friend makes an important point that the military wing of Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organisation, and we have a policy of no contact with Hamas in its entirety. We completely condemn the rocket attacks from Gaza and they are the actions of a terrorist organisation. As I said, Israel has the right to defend itself, but what we have said, and I have said this at the dispatch box and directly to representatives of the Israeli government,
USDA introduced healthier food choices in school meals to benefit 50 million children and expanded free and reduced price lunches for millions of kids. Prior to his appointment, or nomination and confirmation, I should say, Secretary Vilsack served 2 terms.
That is in fact the only way to deliver Palestinian self-determination, to permanently end the Arab-Israeli conflict and preserve Israel's Jewish and democratic identity, and that therefore his department remains committed to achieving that solution based on 1967 borders with agreed land swaps.
Mr. Speaker, I think members in every part of this House and our constituents will have been deeply distressed by the images that we have seen in some of the most holy sites, as you say, not only in Islam but in Christianity and Judaism. It is in everybody's interest to de-escalate, to bring this current period of violence to a conclusion, and then, as he says, work towards what has been a long-standing UK government position of a peaceful two-state solution based on the lines with agreed land swaps through a political process.
27 withdrawn, so we're going to go to Steve Baker. Steve.
Mr. Speaker, given how hard and fast this conflict escalated, and as we approach Eid, can I ask, what will the government do specifically to encourage Israel to guarantee freedom of worship for Muslims at the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
My honourable friend makes, maybe in the future, my honourable friend makes an incredibly important point about the importance during this holy month of Ramadan for worshippers to have access to one of the most holy sites in Islam. And that's something we have communicated with the Israeli government. We will continue to work towards a de-escalation, particularly at this most sensible and religious time. That is a conversation that we have had recently, and we will continue to have both at ministerial and senior official level.
Mr. Speaker, in 2018, I stood in Malfalson in the southern district of Israel, just on the edge of the Gaza Strip, and held in my hands the remains of a Hamas-engineered rocket fired into a playground of school children, with one intention only: to murder mothers and children doing what we have the freedom in this nation to do, raise our kids in peace. The horror in the Holy Land. No right-thinking person could not be heartbroken by what they see on our television screens. But isn't it the case, Minister, that Hamas will not negotiate with Israel because they want to murder Israelis and they want to obliterate the state of Israel off the map of the world? That is their stated objective and position, that the Palestinian people need to free themselves from being used as human shields by a terrorist and political organisation that wishes to continue to rocket launch attacks into Israel. And I would urge the Minister to do everything in his power to persuade the Palestinian people to free themselves from the grip of Hamas.
Mr. Speaker, the rocket attacks by Hamas, which, as I say, whose military wing is a prescribed terrorist organisation by the UK government, is completely counterproductive to the effort for peace, does harm to the Palestinian people. We urge Hamas to cease on behalf of moves towards peace. We urge them to stop these actions because it is completely completely counterproductive to peace and completely against the interests of the Palestinian people in Gaza and elsewhere.
Imran Hamad Khan.
Mr. Speaker, I'm deeply concerned by the escalating tension between Israel and Palestine, and we all here condemn the violence against civilians on both sides, whether that be the murderous missile attacks or what I consider the misguided attempted eviction of Palestinian residents in Sheikh Jarrah. Mr. Speaker, given that the missile technology employed attacking Israeli heartlands could only have come from Iran, does my right honourable friend agree with me that now is not the time to do a deal with Iran that rewards it for instigating further instability in the region, as well as violating its JCPOA nuclear commitments and its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Is this not another reminder, where one needed, that we must not appease this dangerous regime?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not able to speak on the point he's made about the relationship between Iran, or the potential relationship between Iran and Hamas at this point. We are working to de-escalate the situation, as I have said, and to bring about a peace. More broadly, we are seeking to bring greater stability to the region, to dissuade Iran from its destabilising actions within the region, and that will continue to be a priority piece of work for Her Majesty's Government.
Final question, Christian Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The events in Jerusalem have triggered emotive responses here in the UK, and we only need to look at the protests last night to see that. My constituents and others have seen in the past that when conflict erupts in the Middle East, the UK Jewish community is targeted by those wishing to import this complex situation onto our streets, our university campuses and online. So what does my right honourable friend say to those who seek to cause divisions between communities here in the UK, and will he join me in thanking the CST for all the work they're doing to keep the Jewish community safe?
Mr. Speaker, anti-Semitic acts and violence against the Jewish community, wherever they be, are unacceptable. I do pay tribute to the CST and others that seek to keep communities safe. In the UK, we enjoy, for the most part, very good community relations. We should be very proud of that and seek to reinforce that. And I think one of the things that is important for us to do is to demonstrate that we are good friends of Israel, good friends of the Palestinian people, seeking a peaceful two-state solution which can see people of all faiths enjoy the peace and security that they deserve.
Order. I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements for the next business to take place. Okay. Order. I now call the Prime Minister to make a statement. Prime Minister Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. With your permission, I will update the House on our response to COVID. The patience and hard work of the British people have combined with the success of the vaccination programme to reduce deaths and hospitalisations to their lowest level since last July. And from Monday, England will ease lockdown restrictions in line with step 3 of our roadmap. This will amount to the single biggest step of our journey back to normality. But after everything we've endured, we must be vigilant because the threat of this virus remains real and new variants pose a potentially lethal danger, including the one first identified in India, which is of increasing concern here in the UK. So caution has to be our watchword. Our country, like every country, has found itself in the teeth of the gravest pandemic for a century, imposing heartbreaking sorrow on families across the world, with more than 127,000 lives lost in the United Kingdom alone. And our grief would have been still greater without the daily heroism of the men and women of our National Health Service, the protection of our vaccines, already in the arms of over 2/3 of adults across the UK, and the dedication of everyone who has followed the rules and sacrificed so much that we cherish. Amid such tragedy, the state has an obligation to examine its actions as rigorously and as candidly as possible, and to learn every lesson for the future, which is why I have always said that when the time is right, there should be a full and independent inquiry. So, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm today that the government will establish an independent public inquiry on a statutory basis with full powers under the Inquiries Act of 2005, including the ability to compel the production of all relevant materials and take oral evidence in public under oath. In establishing the inquiry, we will work closely with the devolved administrations, as we have done throughout our pandemic response. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, has this morning spoken to the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales and the First and Deputy First Ministers of Northern Ireland to begin those conversations. Every part of our United Kingdom has suffered the ravages of this virus, and every part of the state has pulled together to do battle against it. And if we are to recover as one Team UK, as we must, then we should also learn lessons together in the same spirit. So we will consult the devolved administrations before finalising the scope and detailed arrangements, so that this inquiry can consider all key aspects of the UK response. Mr. Speaker, this process will place the state's actions under the microscope, and we should be mindful of the scale of that undertaking and the resources required to do it properly. The exercise of identifying and disclosing all relevant information, the months of preparation and retrospective analysis, and the time that people will have to spend testifying in public, in some cases for days, will place a significant burden on our NHS, on the whole of government, on our scientific advisors, and on many others. We must not inadvertently divert or distract the very people on whom we all depend in the heat of our struggle against this disease. And the end of the lockdown is not the end of the pandemic. The World Health Organization has said that the pandemic has now reached its global peak and will last throughout this year. Our own scientific advisors judge that although more positive data is coming in and the outlook is improving, there could still be another resurgence in hospitalizations and deaths. We also face the persistent threat of new variants, and should these prove highly transmissible and elude the protection of our vaccines, they would have the potential to cause even greater suffering than we endured in January. And there is, in any case, a high likelihood of a surge this winter when the weather assists the transmission of all respiratory diseases and when the pressure on our NHS is most acute. So I expect that the right moment for the inquiry to begin is at the end of this period in the spring of next year, spring 2022. And Mr. Speaker, I know that there will be some in this chamber and many bereaved families who will be anxious for this inquiry to begin sooner. So let me reassure the House that we are fully committed to learning the lessons at every stage of this crisis. And we've already subjected our response to independent scrutiny, including 17 reports by the Independent National Audit Office and 50 parliamentary inquiries already. And we will continue to do so. We will continue to learn lessons as you have done throughout the pandemic. But no public inquiry could take place fast enough to assist in the very difficult judgments which will remain necessary throughout the rest of the year and the remainder of the pandemic. And we must not weigh down the efforts of those engaged in protecting us every day and thereby risk endangering further lives. Instead, this inquiry must be able to look at the events of the last year in the cold light of day and identify the key issues that will make a difference for the future. Free to scrutinise every document, to hear from all the key players, and analyse and learn from the breadth of our response. And that's the right way, I think, to get the answers that the people of this country deserve, and to ensure that our United Kingdom is better prepared for any future pandemic. Mr. Speaker, entirely separately from the inquiry, there is a solemn duty on our whole United Kingdom to come together and cherish the memories of those who have been lost. Like many across this chamber, I was deeply moved when I visited the COVID memorial wall opposite Parliament. And I wholeheartedly support the plan for a memorial in St Paul's Cathedral, which will provide a fitting place of reflection in the heart of our capital. I also know that communities across the whole country will want to find ways of commemorating what we have all been through. So the government will support their efforts by establishing a UK Commission on COVID commemoration. This national endeavour above party politics will remember the loved ones we have lost, honour the heroism of those who have saved lives, and the courage of frontline workers who have kept our country going, celebrate the genius of those who created the vaccines, and commemorate the small acts of kindness and the daily sacrifice of millions who stayed at home, buying time for our scientists to come to our rescue. We will set out the Commission membership and terms of reference in due course. And in telling the whole story of this era in our history, we will work again across our United Kingdom together with the devolved administrations to preserve the spirit which has sustained us in the gravest crisis since the Second World War, resolving to go forwards together, Mr. Speaker, and to build back better, and I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement, and can I clearly welcome the independent inquiry into the pandemic and the establishing of a UK Commission on COVID commemoration. Both are necessary, both will play an important part in learning the lessons and commemorating those we have lost. Mr. Speaker, let me speak first for the families grieving the loss of a loved one. I too attended the COVID memorial wall that the Prime Minister spoke of opposite Parliament. It is moving. Everybody who's been there knows it's moving. Hearts on the wall, thousands of hearts, stretching from one bridge to the next and rightly facing this place. But I've also taken time to meet the grieving and bereaved families on a number of occasions and talk to them and with them about their experience. Mr. Speaker, those meetings have been amongst the most difficult I've ever had in my life. And the same goes for the staff that came with me and the other members of my team that were in those meetings. Because what those families described was not just the loved one they have lost, the dad, the mum, the sister, the brother, and tell me something about the individuals. It was not just the fact that they had passed away. The hardest bit was the details. They told me about not being able to say goodbye in the way they wanted, whether that was a hospital or elsewhere, and not being able to have a funeral in the way that they wanted. It's very hard to hear some of those stories, and lots of those families have searing questions about what happened, the decisions, what went wrong, why what happened to their families. So it is good that the government is consulting the devolved authorities, of course it is. But the government must also consult the families, because this inquiry will only work if it has the support and confidence of the families. And I urge the Prime Minister and the government to consult the families at the earliest possible moment. The government should also consult those on the front line who have done so much, whether in the NHS, social care or other front lines that we've seen, because they too deserve answers to the very many questions that they have, and they have done so much in this pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the next question is timing. The principle is that the inquiry should be as soon as possible. As soon as possible. Now, I understand an inquiry, a statutory inquiry, will take time to set up. Of course it will. But why can it not be later this year? Why can it not start earlier? And I want to press the Prime Minister just on one particular point. The Prime Minister says the inquiry will start in spring 2022. Is that, Prime Minister, the opening of the inquiry and the beginning of taking of evidence, spring 2022, or is that starting work in setting up the inquiry? They're two very different things. Because if it's the latter, the inquiry won't then be for many months afterwards. So if it is to open, formally open, start taking evidence in the spring of 22, I'd be really grateful if the Prime Minister could make that clear. Then there's the question of the terms of reference. Obviously, that will take time. There'll have to be consultation with the devolved administrations, again with the families and those on the front line, but crucially with this Parliament. This House needs to be involved in the question of what the terms of reference should be. There will be different views across the House and they need to be heard, because this has to have the confidence of all in this chamber. And all relevant questions must be asked and answered. And that must, of course, include the decisions made in the last 14 or 15 months, all of the decisions made. But there are wider questions of preparedness and resilience, particularly about public services, that need to be asked. And, Mr. Speaker, there are reasons why the pandemic hit those in overcrowded houses and insecure work hardest. They need to be addressed as well, and no inquiry that doesn't address those questions will give the answers that many deserve. Finally, Mr. Speaker, there's the question of who chairs the inquiry. Again, this is too early, but I would say this, that the wider the engagement on that question, the wider the likely support for the inquiry. What we need is an independent inquiry which has the full support of everybody, so that its conclusions bear real authority. That will be achieved with the widest embracing of the terms of reference and the chair of the inquiry. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, I do welcome this inquiry, and we will play whatever part we can to make sure that this works well and gets the answers to the questions. And again, we do support the Commemoration Commission, and will work on a cross-party basis to ensure that that is fully the sort of commemoration that the families and others who've lost through this pandemic feel is appropriate. And that should, of course, be on a cross-party basis. It is above politics, and rightly so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his support for both the measures announced today, for the Commemoration Commission, and also for the inquiry. And he asks some entirely justifiable questions about engagement with the bereaved, with those who've been on the front line, about the areas in which the inquiry will want to be focusing, all the background to the growth of the pandemic. And I have no doubt that when it is set up, the inquiry will certainly be looking at all of those, and will be making sure to have the widest possible consultation and engagement. I just think the House should understand that I feel personally very, very strongly that this country has been through a trauma like no other. It is absolutely vital for the sake of the bereaved, for the sake of the whole country, that we should understand exactly what happened. We should learn the lessons. Obviously, we've been learning lessons throughout, but we need to have a very clear understanding of what took place over the last 14 months. I think we owe it to the country to have as much transparency as we possibly can. And I think we owe it to the country to produce answers within a reasonable timescale, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure that the House will want to see that as well, though clearly that will be a matter for the chair of the inquiry in the terms of reference when they are set up. But it is my strong, strong view that the country wants to see a proper, full, and above all, an independent inquiry into the pandemic of the last year. I must repeat my point to him that I do think that the timing that we've set out is the right timing. I think that it would be wrong to devote to consecrate huge amounts of official time, of public health workers' time to an inquiry when they may very well be still in the middle of the pandemic. But clearly, just to clarify the point that the Right Honourable Gentleman raises, the steps taken to set out the terms of reference, to establish the chair of the inquiry, all that will happen before the spring of next year. So we'll be getting it underway, we'll be taking some key decisions, but I think that the House will agree that it would not be right to devote the time of people who are looking after us, who are saving lives, to an inquiry before we can be much more certain than we are now that the pandemic is behind us. And I hope that carries the approval of the House.
Let's go to Caroline Noakes. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Primary care networks have done an incredible job rolling out the vaccine, but GPs and practice nurses need to return to their surgeries and their patients. And as my right honourable friend has said, we have to anticipate a difficult autumn and winter. What reassurance can he give that there will be capacity in the system for second jabs, potentially for booster jabs in the autumn, and the annual rollout of the flu jab?
My honourable friend raises a very important point, particularly about the flu jab, because as she will know, there wasn't much of a flu pandemic over the last winter period. We're worried about people's levels of resistance to flu, but we have the capacity, and we will also have the capacity for the booster jabs as well.
Come to SNP spokesperson Kirsten.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me begin by thanking the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. I was interested to hear the Prime Minister committing to an inquiry. He'll be aware the First Minister already committed to this, and of course the devolved administrations have tailored their decisions to their needs. I do think all of us can feel a sense of optimism, the feeling that after such a difficult year things are edging towards some normality. And the simplest of things, hugging a loved one, have never felt so important after a year of restrictions, and have never, as he said, seen people suffer so much. The vaccines have generated the hope people are feeling now, and that hope is within touching distance. But, Mr. Speaker, just as the hope is fragile, so is the economic recovery. The Prime Minister has just spoken of lessons and answers and timing. This morning's ONS figures demonstrate the depth of the plummet that's been experienced by the economy, and equally show the scale of the recovery needed. That's why the glaring omission of an employment bill from yesterday's Queen's speech was so shocking, a clear signal of a UK government with no recovery plan. So today, let me ask the Prime Minister 3 specific questions on concrete measures that would help kickstart the economy and help those still in need. Firstly, will his government reverse its rigid plan to suddenly end the furlough scheme in September, which will result in a damaging cliff edge for millions of workers? Secondly, there's another damaging cliff edge due in September with the planned Tory cut to the lifeline of £20 universal credit uplift. Is he really still planning to rip that lifeline away from the most vulnerable when they most need it? And finally, as people re-enter the workplace, will the Prime Minister commit to supporting legislation led by my colleague, the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire North, that would finally ban the disgraceful practice of fire and rehire of workers?
Mr. Speaker, the entire programme of this government is dedicated to ensuring that we go from jabs to jobs, as I said yesterday in the Chamber. And she talked about kick-starting an employment recovery. Actually, we have, as she knows, for young people, the £2 billion Kickstart programme to get 18 to 24-year-olds into work, the Restart programme for those who are long-term unemployed. Our campaign, our mission, Mr. Speaker, is to use the resources of the state, as we have done throughout the pandemic, to get people into work. We had to, because of the unusual circumstances, the extraordinary circumstances that we faced, Mr. Speaker, we had to use the resources of the state to keep people out of work. We're now going through a massive programme of investment in infrastructure across the whole of the United Kingdom to get people into work, and I hope that she will support that.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House will welcome the tone and the content of what the Prime Minister has said today, and in particular his proper commitment to the transparency of the inquiry, learning everything we can from the past. If I may just make this point to him, there are 3,500 people across my constituency who are involved in the hospitality sector. And many businesses have invested their own money in making COVID adaptations to ensure the safety of their customers when they return. Given the very sensible roadmap that he has outlined, will he emphasise the increasing role of personal judgment and common sense rather than government fiat, as greater normality returns, and with it, of course, are hugely valued and much cherished civil liberties?
I thank him very much, and as he knows, the hospitality sector in Sutton Coldfield, which I know from my own to be wonderful, will, like the rest of the hospitality sector across the country, be able to open up in full on Monday, including indoors. And as we go forward, we hope, and I can't see any evidence, Mr. Speaker, to contradict this, we hope that we'll be able to open up fully from June the 21st, though people will still clearly need to exercise caution and common sense in the way they go about their lives, because the virus, I'm afraid, is still going to be present in our lives for a long time to come.
Thank you very much.